A quick note before this episode starts. I was experiencing some flaky internet service during this interview, so my apologies for occasional moments of glitchy audio quality. It's mostly just affected my voice, though, and not my guests, so hopefully it won't impact your listening enjoyment. Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, my guest is author Alina Boyden. Her new historically inspired fantasy novel is called Stealing Thunder. It follows Razia, a sought-after dancer and courtesan with a wealthy and powerful clientele. She is also a thief, stealing from clients in cooperation with her found family of hijras. But though her late-night thievery poses constant danger, her greatest fear is the reveal of her past identity. Because Razia was once the crown prince of a nearby kingdom. She escaped her hateful father to live life as a woman, as her true self, on her own terms. When a new client, an influential prince himself, takes a great interest in her, Razia is thrust again into royal politics and conflict. Revelation of her royal origin could bring violence and death by her father's orders, but her precarious situation may also give her the chance to steal back the single thing she loved and lost from her past life. Stealing Thunder arrives May 12th from Ace Books, and Alina, welcome to Fictitious.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm going to apologize to everybody up front for how many times I butcher the pronunciations of things during this episode, but we worked on it ahead of time, and I'm still not going to get it right, but feel free to correct me at any moment.
I mean, I occasionally have issues with my Urdu pronunciation as well, so that's, it's part of learning another language.
Yes. I'm so glad to get you on here because we're recording this in the time of COVID, and like a month or so ago, we were supposed to be on stage together in Seattle at Emerald City Comic Con. We had multiple scheduling, reworks and stuff and things trying to figure out how that whole show was going to happen. And of course it didn't, as nothing is happening right now because we are in the new normal of all cons are dead. And I just saw yesterday, Bookcon is canceled too. And it's such a blow.
When you're releasing a new novel in the midst of all of this, you're always wondering, what is this going to do to the sales figures? What is my career going to do now? And I'm not super anxious about it because, my team at Penguin Random House has been fantastic, but it's always in the back of your mind. And it took me a long time to give up on Emerald City Comic Con. I think it was March 2nd or 3rd. I was still maybe I could go. And then finally Emerald City itself was just you're not coming. And I was yeah, that's probably for the best, but I don't.
That show, my wife and I just sort of had a bad feeling about it, even back as far as December. And we had actually had to cancel out of it our own appearance at it eventually before COVID kind of hit. And then I was working out extra people to take over the panels and stuff because I still wanted all those things to happen. And alas, all those decisions were taken out of my hands anyway with it. So it's supposed to be rescheduled for later in the late summer, early fall. We'll see if any of that happens because everything is up in the air right now. We can only take it one day at a time. But yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, it is an odd spot to be in as an author promoting a new product. You've got a new book hitting in the time period where people cannot go into bookstores. And, all their shopping is for the most part, being done online, except for grocery and essential stuff. So what does that look like right now for your team? Like you said, your publicity team and you figuring out how to market this novel, how to get the word out, how to get it in people's hands when it arrives in stores?
My publicist and my marketer both seem to think we're fine. Or at least that's what they tell me. I don't know what they think behind the scenes, but they tell me we're fine. And they have a really great marketing plan, really great publicity campaign plan that's online anyway. It was going to be heavy digital media because that's where people buy things now. The downside for me personally is that everybody asked me, this is a debut book. It's my first published book. And everybody asked oh, so isn't it so exciting to finally get the ARC in your hands? And I was yeah, it's okay. But what I was really waiting for was to see it on a store shelf. I felt that would make it really real for me. And now that's just not going to happen. Maybe it will later. Hopefully the other debuts in June or whatever don't push it out too far. But it's going to be a wait now to have that moment. I think that's the sort of, if we're talking privileged people problems, people in New York are dying left and right. I think that would be my one negative.
I'm hoping it just turns into delayed gratification, that when stores open back up, that they just take the 5,000 copies of Lord of the Rings and stuff off the shelves for a little bit and spread out the new releases so people can actually see the stuff that's coming out right now. Maybe don't have that many copies of A Song of Fire and Ice or whatever it is, that it takes up 5 bays, and let the debut authors shine or the new books shine.
I wish they would do that more regularly anyway. Not anything against, George R. R. Martin or Tolkien's Ghost, But I think for debut authors, it sort of does hurt fantasy, especially as a genre. Fantasy is a very curated genre, sci-fi fantasy, because, on the shelf, there's always Dune, there's always Lord of the Rings. Those books are twice as old as I am. Lord of the Rings has been older than that. And so it's a very curated genre in that regard, I think.
Yeah, I get frustrated a lot of times when I go to my local store, which has kind of a huge section for those books, and there's plenty of space to face things, and yet entire bays devoted to stuff that everybody already has or can very easily get their hands on. And I get the model of like, if it sells, you push it harder because you want more sales. But there's something very short-term thinking about that. And having worked in tons of bookstores when I was younger, I mean, we saw that stuff all the time. And I'm the guy who I go to the store and I find the books from the people who have been on this show, and I face the novels on the shelves and just make sure that people notice them, because I'm like, if it showed up on here, I want to see some support for it. And if they're only getting spined, I'm going to fix that.
I've done that for some debuts too. I know I'm not supposed to, but there were some debuts that I saw that were from people that I knew. And, it's just hard when they're debuting and they're not getting any visibility. And then you've got these other books that are much, much better established. I mean, it's not going to hurt George R. R. Martin if it's not faced out. So
right, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I hopefully once we can actually see books faced on the shelves again, I will be right back in there fixing that up while looking over my shoulder to make sure that the team in there isn't noticing me reshuffling their shelves. At the top there, I gave my kind of rundown of Stealing Thunder. How do you pitch it? How do you approach people with this story?
I feel like that's I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, and I think every author is just like, oh God, I have to summarize my book. It's always the worst. It's always the part that I hated about querying the most. I actually had a moment when I was in New York talking to an editor and was talking to them about a new project. And it took me an hour to go through what the plot of the project was. And it was just, it was painful. And, but Stealing Thunder is actually quite easy for me to summarize, because I don't remember where I was, but I was talking to someone trying to badly paraphrase what it's about. They said, oh, so it's a pretty woman in the Mughal Empire with dragons. And I was like, no, yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, pretty woman in the Mughal Empire with dragons. Trans pretty woman, but yeah, that's pretty much it. So as an author, you want to be like, well, no, my book's too complicated to encapsulate enough. But then I was like, well, fair. Like on some level, that's what it is. So yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's very much the Hollywood logline type thing, right? The blurb where you can tell people this plus this equals this. That hits home. That says, if you've seen that film, you've got a concept of what it is. Yeah, that sells. That works really well. They did their work for you. Yeah. That
person who, now I've forgotten their name. I feel really bad. I can't remember because it was just so many conversations in such a short time. But yeah, that person really did it for me. That was that's the sort of the Hollywood logline of what Stealing Thunder's about. Obviously, it's got a lot more complication because it's got a trans main character, and the setting's really, I think, exciting and interesting, and it's got a lot of the political drama and all of that Pretty Woman definitely doesn't have, but it's not unfair. So
yeah, it always feels reductive when you're trying to reduce any story down to a couple of sentences, but when you want to get the point across, that does the job. You said this is set or inspired in the Mughal Empire. For the uninitiated audience, of which I am one, what is that time period? What is that kind of setting, and how does that inform this work?
Yeah, so it's inspired by the Mughal Empire in a sort of loose way. It's an empire that existed in the Indian subcontinent for roughly 300-ish years. That was one of the gunpowder empires that kind of spread across Asia at that time period. The rulers were Muslims who were from the Central Asian steppes indirectly, who managed to, by conquest, take over most of the northern half of the Indian subcontinent, almost as far down as the tip of the peninsula at one point. It engaged in wars with other empires around it, but also with indigenous Indian principalities. And so the setting is one in which I've loosely based on the Mughal Empire before it reached its zenith. And so we still have an empire in the south that's modeled loosely again on Vijayanagara, which is a South Indian empire. And we have lots of little princely states that are involved as well. And then there's larger empires sort of on the borders, on the peripheries. So that's the setting. The technology level is like matchlock muskets and swords, bows and arrows. So it's got gunpowder, but it's not really fully developed into the kind of gunpowder we think about when we think about something like the 18th century. So it's more of a 16th century kind of technology level.
And so you've got a professional background as an anthropologist, right?
Yeah. So my undergraduate degree was in medieval history, and I focused on Christian-Muslim cross-cultural relations during the medieval period. After that, I spent a long time not in school. And when I went back to school, it was actually initially for archaeology. So I got my master's degree in anthropology with the archaeology subfield. And 2016 happened, and I was just like, I don't want to be studying 100,000-year-old rocks right now when their earth is on fire and my community is being destroyed and I'm having to fight for civil rights. And so I decided that I wanted to do something that was more meaningful. So I switched to cultural anthropology. And though I'm not in school anymore, I have a master's degree in cultural anthropology as well. And my focus of my research was on the civil rights activism of transgender people in the Indian subcontinent.
And you spent a lot of time over there too, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah. I lived in India for most of the year 2018. And I haven't been back since, unfortunately, because I had to come back for my trial with the ACLU against the state of Wisconsin for trans healthcare. And then after we won that case, I had to finish some things with school and then COVID. And, it's been kind of a crazy year and a half, or maybe just a year since then. So, yeah.
Everything's a lot, especially right now. Everything's a lot. Yeah, and also, balancing a career, writing and studying and activism and all that stuff, those are a few dozen things to kind of hold on to. So I get that entirely. It's worth noting, like, whenever you are a white person writing about other cultures, that can always be kind of shaky ground to be on. Clearly, you have the educational background and lived experience in being in the space. But what other ways do you kind of vet any kind of material that touches on other cultures like this? Is that sensitivity readers, or how did you go about it?
Well, so, first of all, I think that when you're writing anything, you have to acknowledge that you're writing it from a particular positionality. And that positionality is going to be different from other people's. So from the start, writing this book, my positionality makes it different than if I were a different person. And so you have to be cognizant of that and realize that along the way, you may have some blind spots that you need to shore up. And so I think it's always important to take that into consideration first and foremost, because then when you get feedback from people, you can take it under advisement and you can make changes that are necessary if they're necessary. So for me, I have a lot of South Asian friends who really wanted to read this book, cis and trans. And so they read it. And initially, it wasn't necessarily going to be published. I was an unpublished author at the time. And so, yeah, I said, yeah, you can read it. Like, you're my audience. Like, at this point, I don't have an international audience or anything like that, or even a national audience. So go for it. And then after they read it, I said, well, is there anything wrong in it? Is there anything that looks dumb? Is there anything that says, like, that's bad? And they were like, no, it's great. There's nothing bad in it. And I was like, oh, okay. And that when people say there's nothing bad in it, then you get a little suspicious, like, really? Is that, I don't know. And so then I had other people read it, and really there wasn't a lot of feedback in terms of sensitivity items missed. Then it got picked up by Penguin Random House, and my editor was like, can you have some sensitivity reviewers go through it? And I was like, well, half a dozen to more than that South Asian people have read it already. Do you want me to do more? And she was like, yeah. And so I said, okay. And so I picked like 3 friends of mine who were Americans, but who are of South Asian ancestry. They're members of the South Asian diaspora community. And I knew they would be really critical. They're all academics and they're all really critical people. And I was like, okay, I'm going to put it in front of these 3 people and see if they come up with something that is glaringly obvious that I missed, or something that's maybe not obvious that I missed, that's in there that's gonna be offensive to people. They went through it, and the only change that was made was one of my friends is a just really, really, really good, talented South Asian dancer of different styles, mostly South Indian styles, but she's been branching out into Kathak recently, which is the style that I sort of based Razia's dancing on. And she's like, well, she's doing Kathak, Alina, but there's no tabla, which is a kind of drum. And she's like, you can't do Kathak without a tabla. You have to have the tabla. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I rewrote the scene so that there's a tabla in there. And that was the one thing that really stuck out to her was, like, as a dancer, like, she was like, no way, you can't, like, that's the rhythm of the beat of the music. And if you don't have that, like, what are you really dancing to? What are you playing off of? And so I was like, oh, okay. So, and as somebody who's like not a dancer and has no rhythm, I was like, thank you for that advice. I had no idea. So
that is an important point. Yeah.
It's been one of those things where I think, like, it sort of naturally happened anyway. I did reach out to other people to make sure that I had sensitivity reads on it, once it was picked up. But it had naturally, as I wrote, like when I finished it, had a lot of South Asian eyes on it already to go through it and to tell me whether they thought that there was anything wrong. I had professors at the American Institute of Indian Studies in Lucknow. Those professors went through it as well. So, it had a lot of eyes on it. Yeah.
The protagonist here, Razia, is trans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not 100% certain on this, so if I'm speaking out of turn here, then let me know. But I think this is the first major publishing house novel with at least in sci-fi and fantasy, with a trans protagonist. Is that right?
I have been told to never say anything's the first because somebody will find something that we missed, right?
Right, yes, yeah.
My knowledge, it's the first of its kind. Yeah, it's the first. And to my knowledge, too, in sci-fi fantasy, certainly with the big five, I think I'm the first trans woman to get published with a trans main character. I know there's been at least one other trans woman who's been published in sci-fi fantasy, but her character's all cis. So it's something that, to my knowledge, obviously we have to add that caveat because I haven't read everything in the world, and there could very well be something that I've missed. But yeah, to my knowledge, it's the first of its kind, which kind of is depressing more than it's heartening, because it speaks to sort of the lack that's been in not just the sci-fi fantasy genre, but in entertainment in general. I mean, when I grew up, I never once in my entire childhood saw a single story that had a main character like me in it. Not one. And I think that's a hard thing for some people to understand, like the damage that does when you have no visibility at all, when you have just no characters that are like you, no sense of that it's okay or that it's normal or that you can do great things if you're this way. That was really, really difficult growing up.
Yeah, I am a cisgendered white guy, straight guy. And even I, like, as a kid, I'm growing up as a nerd. I felt like I was separate from the people who were around me. And I remember the first time I saw Kevin Smith's movies where I was like somebody who talked like me, and I was like, oh my God, I feel represented. And then I got older and realized I'm like, oh my God, I've been so overrepresented all the time. And even though I felt in my own little niche way, like I hadn't had something that really spoke to my voice, coming to that realization that there were so many other people who had zero representation at all was like getting hit over the head with a hammer, getting that sense of like, oh, I see myself everywhere I look. And especially, I mean, like, I'm a pretty generic looking dude, so I really see myself everywhere I look. And then to find out, that realization that so many other people don't ever see themselves. And so, I mean, I think that's changing. It's incremental and slow and sometimes full of its exciting moments. And like you said, so many times where it's a frustrating, like, it's a first. That's not really something to be celebrated in that sense. It's like, should have happened a long time earlier, but at least it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that it's bad, right? Obviously, it's a good thing to have that change in that representation out there. And there's some other authors who have April Daniels, Meredith Russo, who are writing trans characters and have for the last maybe not a decade, but 6 years or something like that. And they're both trans women as well. They write in the sort of YA subfield, one contemporary and one doing something that's superhero related. So you could argue it's sci-fi. And so, there's a little bit going with smaller presses with trans women, but generally speaking, it's been something that's been really absent. And so I'm hoping that Stealing Thunder at least gives a lot of trans women the ability to see themselves in fiction. That's one of the major, that's part of the reason that I wrote it anyway. So
let's talk about how that relates to the main character with Razia, and in particular, this kind of sisterhood of courtesans. Totally botching the word for it earlier, so I'm going to try not to say it and mess it up until you say it again. But what can you tell me about her particular situation and the group of people, this like sort of found family that she has?
Oh, the hijra. Yeah. So I'm going to actually answer a different question that you sort of had sent that you were going to ask anyway, along the way to answering this question.
Sure.
Which is to say, why did I write, this book in a setting of South Asia? And the reason is that I wanted to write a fantasy novel that had a trans woman main character. I'd made kind of a commitment to myself that I was going to just write trans women for a while and not going to write any cis characters, because I wanted at least to represent some fiction for other trans women that I could, pass the book to in PDF format. I wasn't expecting to get published. I'd been trying for 17 years when Stealing Thunder finally got picked up, I guess, something like that, 16 years, whatever it was. So when I set out to write fantasy with a trans woman main character, I had this moment of like, well, how? Right? Because like, if you look back, in the way that a lot of white fantasy authors have done to the European medieval past. First of all, they've whitewashed it too much. Obviously, the European medieval past had a diverse cast of characters, and I was trained in it. And so I knew from the time I was 19 of a particular court case of a trans woman in 1395, Eleanor Reichener, in London, who was arrested for practicing that ignoble and ignominious vice with the clergy for money. Near as we can tell, she was like giving services to priests for money in back alleys of London in 1395. And as a young trans girl, and when I was 19, when I read that, I was like, oh my God, like there's a trans girl, like right there in 1395 in London. But she's the only one, right? And she's alone. There's no evidence either that the medieval people who are interviewing her have any conception of like gender identity or what she is, or she's just this curiosity to them that they have to interrogate. And so when I set out to write a book, I just kept coming up to situations in the book where the character is constantly having to have this discussion of what they are to every person they meet. And the other person has to have this surprise reaction. And it was exhausting to me to write. I can't imagine what it would be like to read it. And at the same time, I was doing all this research in South Asia. And the thing that had sort of struck me and inspired me the most about South Asia is that every South Asian person knows what a trans person is. Like when I came out to my mom and told her I was trans, she was like, what's that? And I was like, oh God, this will be a long conversation. I mean, this was back in 2002, you know, when I transitioned. So it's a long time ago. But in South Asia, everybody knows what a trans person is. The trans people are on the streets, you know, begging for money often, but they're on the streets, they're visible, and people know who they are. They are fully aware of what being trans is. Now, there may be some misconceptions about transness that exist in South Asian culture, but aside from that, they know. And so nobody has to ask, what's a hijra? Everybody knows what a hijra is, right? And so I was like, wow, that's amazing for a fantasy setting because you can, you know, and we have evidence that the hijra community goes back a very long way. And so I was like, wow, it'd be a very, you know, great fantasy setting because you wouldn't have to have this boring conversation all the time about what are you, where do you come from? You wouldn't have to have, I think the other thing that really struck me is I was like, oh my God, I could have more than one trans girl in a book. Literally, the idea had not occurred to me until that moment. I was like, oh my God, she doesn't have to be the lonely only trans girl in the story. She could have other trans girls around her. And so Stealing Thunder opens with 3 trans women having a conversation. That's never been done before, to my knowledge, in any published book ever in terms of fiction. I mean, I know memoirs, sure, but like to open a book with 3 trans women having a conversation together, that blew my mind. And so the hijra community is a community in South Asia. I think there's some misconceptions about what it is. Oftentimes the word hijra is taken to mean a gender identity, and it is not. It is a community identity. So to be a hijra, you need to be a disciple, a chela, of an established guru or leader who runs a hijra household, a dera. And so that's what a hijra is somebody who's a member of that society. And that society has entrance and exit fees, and it has initiation sort of practices, and it has rules and regulations, and it is sort of like an entity unto itself that is really well organized and hierarchical. If you are not a member of that community, you are not a hijra. It doesn't matter what your gender identity is. You're just not, because that's what the definition is. Now, to be a member, you have to be a person who is assigned male at birth and who has some form of trans feminine gender identity. All the hijras I know personally are trans women, but I'm told that there's non-binary hijras as well. But they're all assigned male at birth if they're full members, and they all have trans feminine gender identities. So oftentimes people say, oh, well, hijra means transgender. Well, it doesn't really. That conflation comes because everybody who's in that community is some flavor of transgender, but those two are separate identifiers, right? The hijra identifier is the marker of community status, and the transgender identifier is the gender identity marker. So I think that's where there's a lot of confusion, and that confusion sort of is compounded by the fact that, like, if you read Urdu language newspapers, oftentimes in Urdu they'll say khwajasara, which is another term effectively for that community. They don't like the term hijra in Pakistan because it's considered a slur. In India, it often isn't considered a slur. So you have to be careful with your use of language. But they will just translate that directly as transgenders with an S in a way that would make me cringe if it were an American newspaper. But, that's a perfectly valid way of saying it for them. So when you get this translation effect where they say, oh, this translates as this, our natural inclination is to think, aha, so that means that hijra equals transgender. And that's not really the case. Hijra equals a community marker, and transgender is just happens to be everybody in the community is trans to some degree.
So that's a lot of cultural complexity to then translate into a fantasy novel.
Oh my God. It really is. I don't know. My critics will tell me whether I did it justice or not. I think that ultimately I didn't want to bog the reader down with a dissertation on the subject. I wanted to have a community that was there. The community has the similar hierarchical structure to what you would see in a hijra community today. However, I don't really go into some of these ties as deeply as I would if I were writing an academic paper about it. And I also don't ever use the word transgender in the book because it seemed to me a very artificial term to implant into a fantasy setting of any sort of culture, because the term transgender, I didn't even call myself that when I transitioned because the word was not in, common parlance. It's one of those things where language changes very quickly around minority groups. And so the language around being trans has changed tremendously just in my lifetime, just since I transitioned, even not even my lifetime, but just since I transitioned, which was 18 years ago. So I didn't include the word transgender anywhere in the book. And so that means that, that level of nuance is a little bit obscured in the book. I don't ever have, Razia sort of explain that hijra equals transgender because that's not in there.
I think contextually it's definitely in the novel. What's interesting, very right off, is that Razia and her Dara of the sisterhood, they are courtesans, and they are hired by this wealthy merchant to come entertain a group of men at this gathering. The clientele are firmly aware of who they are and of their backgrounds, and that is not a point of contention in any way, which I found really refreshing in there. And then Razia in the process of this meets this other prince, and they start a relationship, which is sort of the catalyst for a lot of the story. His station versus her original previous station and sort of her past life. There's some echoes of those things there, and also some dissonance, I would think, as well, for what happens there. So can you kind of walk us through a little bit of Razia's background? And I want to make a note here that this is not a story of transition, because at the point when we join this story, that has already happened. Razia's been living as a woman for 4 years, I think.
You'd know better than me. I wrote the book 3 years ago, and
I think it's about 4 years since she had left her home. And so, and I think that was another thing that was nice about it too, is that we were already with the person who is living as herself, but she does have to deal with the ramifications of her family background and stuff. So kind of talk about that royal background, how that affects her and her motivations. And then we'll get to Arjun and how that works too.
Sure. And just to say, it's not a transition narrative. I'm tired of them. I really am. They're necessary, I think, to have that representation. But that's to me, all the stories are always oh, and then the trans person transitions and people either accept them or they don't. And that's the end of the story. And I'm well, that was 18 years ago for me. I've had a life since then. Things have happened. And so for Razia, I really wanted to make it a story where, transition is not a factor. That happened a while ago. So also, it's true to a lot of the stories of trans women that I know from South Asia, in the sense, not that any of them, were princes who ran away, but that oftentimes they're forced out of their homes at a young age, as young teenagers, and end up in a dera where they have this found family. And it's not just in South Asia. I know people in America who've had that same story who are trans women. I know some cis gay men who've had that story where they end up in New York and they're homeless and they find their way into a house of similar people because that's the option that's left to them when they've been abandoned by their families. And so the issue with Razia is that she, at the age of about 13, has been abandoned by her family and she runs off to just get away from it. I don't think you find out in the first book how she ended up exactly where she ended up. That's book 2, people. But she ran away from home, we'll say, and she ended up finding her way to this house of other trans women where she now lives, and she's lived there for a while. And the houses are based on both traditional hijras and on Tawaif culture. And Tawaif culture is a culture of courtesans that existed in the Indian subcontinent, and very famously sort of shown in like films like Jan, of these really highly trained women who knew how to sing and how to dance and how to recite poetry and how to invent poetry on the spot. I mean, and Urdu poetry is very complicated. And so this is a high level of training that impresses very wealthy people. It costs a lot to train one of these tawis, one of these courtesans. And so that cost that's borne by the head of the house, in this case, the guru, has to be paid back somehow, right? And so she has the right to the wages then of the person that she's trained up. And so in this case, Razia is in a situation where she was trained to be this courtesan, and the way that she pays her guru back is by giving her the wages that she earns as a courtesan. And so that keeps the house running, that enables them to help other trans children who are on the street. And it also enables the guru, when she's past her, shall we say, earning years, to have an income. And it's actually rooted in some really depressing realities of the sort of earning potential of someone who's in one of these courtesan houses in actual history, where once they hit the age of 30, they're well past their prime, and that's the end of their career effectively. And so you have to plan for retiring at 30. And part of that plan for retiring at 30 is to have other people who are still able to be courtesans and to take a share of that income as well. And so, and you make that investment for that to happen. So that's the situation that she finds herself in when the book opens.
Well, and Razia is also a thief, and a fairly accomplished one, and is working in coordination with her Dara and with her guru in order to pull off some pretty audacious acts of thievery from some of the clientele. And like you said, that a lot of it is this long-term thinking of, they know there's a certain point where they are not viable as a courtesan, so they have to be thinking about the future, which is a compelling reason to add theft into your repertoire, for sure.
And this is there's a lot of negative tropes about theft and sex work that, I didn't want to reproduce here. And so kind of, in a sense, what I've done is produce some really audacious thefts. It's not like they're mugging their clients. It's like, oh no, this is the kind of fantasy cat burglar escapades, rather than something that's more mundane and that would fit into sort of some of these, I feel like, negative tropes.
So she's a former prince, and we learn this very quickly into the novel, and she's run away. One of the things that she's left behind as well is that the royal ruling class in these various principalities and kingdoms, they have this sort of this feathered dragon creature called the Zahak. And that's a fairly pivotal element of this story as well, even being sort of referenced by the title. What can you tell me about the Zahak and their place in this?
Honestly, Stealing Thunder originated out of, it turned into something that I was not expecting at all when I set out to write a book, because my first thought was it was kind of a response to Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, because in the Temeraire series, the dragons are essentially ships, and they're captained like ships, and they have like many people on their backs and so forth. And I thought to myself, like, that's not how that works. I fly planes. If something were that heavy, it wouldn't fly at all. Like, that's ridiculous. It would be more like fighter planes. And so I was like, well, how would I do fighter planes? And then I was like, well, you could do dragon fighter planes. And I was like, I don't know. I don't really like dragons. They're not aerodynamically plausible. And so then I was like, well, they had feathers. And then if you looked at the wing area, and then if you sort of changed the shape of them, and then, oh yeah, that could work. And then I was like, okay. And the term Zahak is derived from one of the early Persian words for dragon, because there's not really an indigenous dragon mythology in South Asia in the same way that there is in, say, Europe. They do have words that have come over to Urdu, for example, Ajdaha and Zahak. So both of those are derived from the Persian. So I have this Persian word for these feathered dragon creatures, but fundamentally it was just out of my own, like, nerdy inability to have a non-aerodynamic creature in the stories, honestly. But I think also it adds something to it because, you think of royal courts and, maybe like peacocks, and they're these very brightly colored creatures. And so I think that there's something really cool and novel about them as well, other than just the fact that I had to like calculate, their max gross takeoff weights, because that's who I am as a person. So.
Well, there's something to be said to you about there are various kinds of Zahaks, and, there are fire ones and there are thunder Zahaks, and they have breath weapons, which, being a D&D person, I'm like, breath weapons, right? I know what's going on here.
Different turn rates and different speeds and different climb rates. And when I did them, I designed them off of different birds of prey that have different characteristics for their flying. And then I have a very close friend who's a former lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And he looked at my Zahak designs and he's like, oh yeah, you can definitely see how mission oriented these birds are. And I was like, yes, I did it. So
it's a nice compliment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very pleased. I was like, mission accomplished on that regard.
Yeah, there's a fun sequence where Razia flies Arjun's Zahak, and and the whole time is taking into account that the Fire Zahak is a much bulkier, larger, different flyer than a Thunder Zahak is. And I appreciated that, recognizing that difference. This is a completely different creature. It flies differently, can glide, where a Thunder Zahak really can't. It's almost hummingbirding, flapping all the time. I like those details. I thought those were very cool. And it's definitely something to look forward to in this story. Thinking about Razia as a character and thinking about this background, and we've covered extensively sort of the background of this world and some of the things to be thought about. This is probably going to be a lot of readers' first trans protagonist. And so I think there's a lot of emotional and cultural complexity that, is the backstory of a person, and trying to figure out how to pace a story, how to give them all of this stuff while introducing some things that they may not be familiar with. How do you manage the pacing of the story? How do you balance all those different elements? How do you bring in that exposition and give that over time so that you're not overloading somebody who's new to this particular type of experience?
Wow. It's a challenge. Like I said, when I first started, I was having situations in one of the earlier, the very first draft that I ever wrote that was anything like this. It was a situation where, because I hadn't figured out a setting that really worked, I was constantly having to explain the character to everybody. It was exhausting. And two, it's so much harder in some ways to write a trans character than a cis character, just because society comes with so many defaults. And if you have a cis girl character in a book, you have some defaults that you're already operating with on how she was born, how her parents raised her. Everybody's different, but to some degree, especially in a fantasy world, she probably encountered sexism, and this is probably what's accepted of her. If you have a princess character in a book who's going to have an arranged marriage, there's been a trope for that for about 1,000 years. And when you're looking at a trans character, where do I start? And then you have to figure out, what did her family think of it? What did the people around her think of it? Was she accepted? Was she rejected? Was she, threatened with murder? Was she, was it not a big deal? How do you, and every time you do that, you have to kind of figure out how you're going to set it up. And in the case with Razia, of course, her father's got a really negative reaction to it, just a profoundly negative reaction to it, and has put her life in danger. Well, that is a lot of backstory, like you said, to start a book off with, and you don't want to front load all that exposition necessarily. And I think that the way that I get around that pacing is honestly having lived as a trans woman. Every time I meet people and they're like, oh, you're trans? When you come out to somebody as trans, you have to decide, am I going to come out to this person now? Do they already know that? Because nowadays, you Google my name and everybody knows, it's not a huge secret at this point, but 6 years ago, nobody in the state of Wisconsin, except for myself and my doctor, knew that I was trans. So it's a different thing when you're as publicly out as I am versus when you're not. But yeah, I've lived my life having to always decide when and how much to tell people. When are they sufficiently, when is their curiosity satisfied, but they're not bored yet? That's when you cut, it's when you stop talking about it. And so I think that sort of helps prepare me for how to keep the pacing alive while at the same time doling out these little tidbits of the past. Yeah.
What is your outlining process, or do you outline?
I don't outline. I never outline, ever. Actually, this book I didn't expect to get published at all. I was floored when I got an agent off this book, because I had been trying since, I guess, 2003 to get a book published. And I had written, Stealing Thunder was manuscript number 201, I think.
Oh my God.
I wrote really fast. Well, I write less fast now that I'm a professional, because there's a lot of performance anxiety and there's a lot of stuff. But even then, by the standards of professionals, I write pretty fast. I wrote the sequel in 4 months or something, totally done, start to finish. And Stealing Thunder, though, I wrote in I think 2.5 weeks. I don't know, something like that. The last 1,000 words I wrote in one day. It was one draft. It was an unedited draft except for typos. And I had no outline and I had no real notes. I started the book because the character kind of spoke to me at the beginning. And then I wrote the thing start to finish. And that was pretty much it. And what's on the page is what I wrote, more or less. There's been now, it's been through a professional editor. So there's been mostly additions, actually, because it was written so fast. The thing that kept coming up with the editors was like, what does Razia think about this? What does Razia think about this? Like, she should have some inner monologue about this. And when I looked back now, I was like, wow, that didn't have very much inner monologue in it. You should have had more. So it was good advice from my editors. But yeah, fundamentally, it was just a seat of the pants, one shot right for Stealing Thunder. Not all of my books are that sort of unplanned, but this one just happened to be. So.
Is it a silly question to ask if you did have any kind of plotting method you were thinking of or adhering to?
I mean, so, honestly, like, I had never found a methodology that I liked. All of the how to write books that I'd ever read, I didn't like because they never spoke to my own process. And they always tried to shackle me to things that I felt like. I want to start by saying every author is different. If you outline, it's okay. And if you don't outline, it's okay. And whatever process works for you. Stick with it if it works for you. And so I want to start there. It doesn't mean you're not a true writer if you outline or whatever. Like, that's ridiculous. But I want to say that, like, for me, when I write, if I outline, I feel like the book is dead. Like, it kills the book for me. So I tried one time to outline a book. I outlined the whole book. And then whatever in my brain wants to write a book felt satisfied by the outline. It was like, okay, job done. And I was like, no, we have to write it now. And I was like, oh, got zero interest in writing this now. And I've never written it. I tucked it away. I'll never touch it again because that job was sort of mentally done by the outline for me. So I think I like to write it in a very organic way where the characters' decisions feel like they're making an impact on what's happening in the story. And I almost liken it to an altered state of consciousness in a way, and not to get all metaphysical about it. But I read this article that said that when actors are acting, the part of their brain that regulates their identity of self is suppressed on MRIs. And I was like, wow, that actually explains to me how it is I can write a book and have characters surprise me. Because all the time I'll go in with a plan for a scene for the day and I'll start writing something. And then the scene will just take this 180 because that character doesn't want to behave that way. And it doesn't feel like that's a decision I made. Obviously, it's all coming from my brain. Let's be real about it. But the perception from my end is like, whoa, that character did something I totally wasn't expecting. Well, how can a character surprise you if you wrote the character? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But that's what the perception is. And I think that sort of feeling is something that I think that's the addiction of writing for me. And it kills my addiction if I've planned it out in advance, because then the character's never going to surprise me.
There's Trisha Levenseller was on the show a couple episodes ago, and she was talking about the fact that she discovery writes, even though she outlines stuff, typically she discovery writes romance and she discovery writes secondary characters who just appear on their own, and she gets to have those moments of surprise and, finding it out for the first time as it's being written. And I get what you're saying about as far as like writing the outline and you feel like, I don't know, like there's a part of your brain that's like, job's done.
Well, because all the hard stuff's left now. Like, you did all the excitement of figuring out a story. You did all the excitement of figuring out where it's going to go and what the characters are going to do. And then the stuff that sucks is the actual the actual words on page, right? You have to sit there and type it. Well, what gets me going and what makes me want to sit there and type it is that I don't know what's going to happen next on some level. Like, I have an idea, but characters still surprise me. It still feels organic. It feels almost like watching a movie in my head. It's a great process. I really enjoy it. If I've outlined it and I know where it's going, it's like watching a movie for the 80th time and having to like take down the dialogue. And that just kills me inside. I can't do that. But one book that really did help me and that I think is really cool is that Peter Brett told me, get a copy of Writing to Sell. And so I got a copy of Writing to Sell and Scott Meredith. It was great. Because at no point does he tell you that you have to follow a plot structure. At no point does he tell you that you have to structure anything. But if you do structure things, it doesn't disagree with that either. It just says basically like, how do you write a novel? Well, a novel is a series. Like, his definition of a novel blew my mind. I was like, this is amazing. And he's just like, a novel is the story of a hero trying to attain a goal and failing to attain it until they finally attain it. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's the dirt simplest definition of a novel. Like, the character has something that they must have, they must do, whatever it is. And for whatever reason, they can't seem to do it. And the course of them trying and failing to do it is what you read, because you want the suspense of, are they going to do it? And then you get to the end and sure enough, they did it. And that's the story. Or maybe they didn't do it and it's a downer of an ending. I don't like downer endings, but, some people do. So when I read that from Scott Meredith, I was like, that really helps me to organize my thoughts, because I'm almost too disorganized sometimes. And that organizational pattern of remembering, well, the tension comes from them not succeeding at this thing. So maybe have the villain have them not succeed. That helps me.
And well, then the last question then is tools of the trade. What do you use as far as software, and do you do anything analog and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. So I write with a MacBook Air with Pages, and that's all I use. And I have to convert the files into Word for my editor and my agent, which is always obnoxious. And I wish they would just not use Word, because Word is a clunky program. I used to use Word when it actually functioned, and it's a disaster. It crashes all the time, no matter what system you're using. I love Pages. I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for that, but I love Pages.
It's super clean. Like it's so streamlined. Yeah.
All I want is to pick a font and to type. And my way, like, I don't outline, but I take obsessive notes, like of, oh, this is a cool, like, thing. Like right now I'm working on a YA project, and it's going to be kind of medieval-ish in its setting. So I'm doing a lot of medieval stuff. So anytime I come across like, oh, this is how much this costs, or this is like what a tavern looks like, or this is like what, I will write it down in one document that is currently, this one is like 25,000 words long, and it's in no order whatsoever. But I remember when I was doing what research so I could use it. But I don't think, like, if somebody had to assemble my last book because I got hit by a bus or something, like, it would never happen. You'd never be able to do it because they're just totally scatterbrained. But those are my tools. This is the most unhelpful methodology course I think that's ever. I wrote 200 failed manuscripts over the course of 15 years until one just happened to be successful. That's helpful.
Every writer's journey is radically different. What I like about all of these stories when I talk to people on this show is that my guess is that every person's story that sounds completely singular to them or so idiosyncratic that there is at least one listener out there going, oh my God, that's how my brain works. Right. And
that's helpful to know that you're not like, and I think that's the most important thing, is that, like, oftentimes when you're an unpublished writer, you think, if I just had that trick or that tool, if I just used that program, or I just organized myself in this way, or if I just edited like this, I would be able to break in finally. And unfortunately, nobody who actually breaks in has any idea how it happened. Not the slightest clue. Why Stealing Thunder and not any of the other novels that I wrote before it? I don't know. Is Stealing Thunder better demonstrably? Probably, maybe. I don't know. But it's, not so much better that it should have been the one that broke the career open. But you find the one person who feels strongly enough and believes in it enough to send it out to somebody else, and they find somebody who believes in it enough that they give you money for it, and then all of a sudden you have a publication. And that's like, kind of, as an unpublished person, that's like the least satisfying answer. Like, it was really unsatisfying to me to query and query and query away. And then it's just like, well, it just didn't hit for me. It just didn't hit for me. And you're just like, what do I have to do? Like, just somebody tell me what to do and I will do it. And it got to the point where I was so despondent. I had like stopped submitting things. And I only submitted Stealing Thunder because I was like urged to. And I was like, well, what the hell? Roll the dice. I don't like grad school that much. I'll throw it out there. But I didn't expect that it would be a response because it hadn't been for 15 years. And I think as an unpublished person, you just think, what's the point after a while almost? You just get so discouraged by it after a long period of time. And unfortunately, the answer is just like, keep doing it. Don't stop doing it. If you love doing it, keep doing it. And eventually, hopefully, fingers crossed, it's gonna break through. But it's like no guarantee. I wish that I knew what it was that had, like, that was the hardest part about writing a second bookitis. Holy God, You did the thing after all this time. You have no idea how you did it. Then you have this contract that says, do another one by next year and have it be of publishable quality. And you're like, well, I don't know how the first one was and now I have to do a second one. And it's just like panic inducing because you're like, oh my God, do I have to write another 200 manuscripts for one to be publishable again? Is that my process? Is that my method? Is that what I have to do? And so like, yeah, the second book for a published author is because you have no idea what happened and how you landed in that position. And then they're like, yeah, just make lightning strike twice. Just do that. And you're like, oh, okay, cool.
That's a very universal experience from the conversations I've had where every author's been like, oh my God, a sequel is so much harder. I make the analogy that it's like musicians and bands often find that their second record is far harder to record and write than their first one. And then granted, this is different when you've written, 200 manuscripts, but their first record, they've had their entire life to compose, and their second record, they got a year or two, and suddenly pressure and interest and fans and a set style or something that's expected of them. And yeah, so all of a sudden there are parameters on you that didn't exist before, and that changes the creative process.
Well, I think that's true. And I think it's the pressure, first of all, because the pressure is tremendous. And then the second thing is like they really, like, literally, what's the sequel? Do the exact same thing you did before, but in a way that doesn't seem like it's the same thing at all.
The same, but different.
Yeah. Do the same thing, but make it different. And you're like, okay, great. Cool. I'll go do that. Sequel's in, I did it. So I felt really good about it too. That one was not nearly a seat of the pants. That was like 4 drafts and a lot of tinkering and a lot of going back. But I tend to be one of those people who will just like delete 60,000 words and start over. Like, so I'll just be like, nope, that didn't work. I'll just cut that 40,000 word chunk and start writing back from where it was and just write from that point.
People can't see how big my eyes are right now, but oh my God, that's my nightmare. It's just the idea.
For the sequel to Stealing Thunder, the book as it sits now, and we haven't done the edit letter yet, is like 120,000 words or something. And I wrote, I think 450,000 words to get that 120,000. So wow. It's a lot of not good drafts, like a lot of stuff that just got cut. And like, the funny thing is it wasn't even like separate drafts. It was like, I wrote 20,000 words that I liked. Well, maybe I don't like that 5,000. That's gone. And then like, okay, now I wrote 50,000 that are, no, I don't like those. I'll delete that whole 50,000 chunk and I'll just keep. And so the first chapter stayed the same and every other chapter sort of got cut back to chapter 1 again at some point. So, but first chapter was good. So I don't know.
Hey, as long as the bones and the foundation are there, right?
I don't know what bones are. Like, that's too much.
Alina, where should people be following you online? Because like you said, I mean, this novel is just arriving. The sequel is already written and going through editing and stuff like that. So how should people keep up with you and your writing going forward?
So I definitely am most active probably on Twitter for public outreach. I'm active on Facebook all the time on my personal page, but less so on my author page because I feel like Facebook is this medium where you feel like you have to have something reasonably important to put out there. Whereas Twitter, you can kind of just do whatever. It's kind of a cesspool, so it's fine. You went out there. My Instagram used to be really lit because I was in Europe for a month, but now we're doing COVID, so it is not lit. And it's got some things going on, but I'm not always the best at Instagram. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, you'll get the updates. If you follow me on Facebook, you'll get the important updates. And if you follow me on Instagram, I think the most recent thing is like a pic of a mushroom farm. So who doesn't want that?
People who are managing to be interesting on Instagram during the time of COVID, they blow my mind. I don't know how that works. I don't know how to be interesting on Instagram in the best of times. So, yeah.
There's this form. They're like, yeah, use your camera and tell us. And I was like, are you kidding me right now? Like, even thinking pictures. Like, I don't know what this is. Like, I'm a writer. I'm not an artist, So, yeah.
It's a lot of cross-classing,
Yeah, right. Yeah, you have to branch out. And then too, for me, like, the funny thing is like, I was on social media lockdown when I was an ACLU client. And so until January of 2019, I wasn't even allowed to have public social media accounts. I had signed a contract with the ACLU not to have them because they don't want their clients saying something stupid and causing a kerfluffle, and so like delving out. And then I got published and they're like, we want you to have social media accounts. And I was like, social what now? That's been an interesting transition. So, yeah.
Well, it's nothing if not a very interesting road to all of this stuff. As I said at the top, Stealing Thunder comes out May 12th from Ace, which is a division of Penguin Random House. There's so many names. There's so many divisions of these things. It's really hard to keep track of. It doesn't matter to the average reader. All they care about is that the book is out and that they can get their hands on it and they can enjoy it. And Alina, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really appreciated it.
This has been Season 5, Episode 6 of Fictitious. Listen and subscribe to the program on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search for the show using your favorite podcasting app. You can also find a full archive of every episode at fictitiouspodcast.com. If you'd like to support my work with Fictitious, there are 2 great ways to do so, either by becoming a monthly supporter on Patreon or through donations using Ko-Fi. Patreon subscribers will receive patron-exclusive content, including video blogs and mini podcasts. Accompanying this episode is an additional chat with Alina Boyden, where we discuss what would happen if she crossed over her characters and their feathered dragons into other fantasy worlds, plus a lot more. It's available only to Patreon supporters. To join, go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Patreon. You can also make a one-time donation using Ko-Fi. It's fast and easy and very much appreciated. Go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Ko-Fi to get started. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on your social profiles, tell all your book-loving friends, or write a review. All of that supports the authors who appear on the program and helps me to grow the podcast. My next interview features author Emily B. Martin. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.